which makes it all the more interesting and fascinating, and gives us a great reminder of how diverse and how personal literature eventually is. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Today we're going to ask a very simple question. Is it possible to look at the same history in a history book? Is it possible to look at the same people in history and the same events and give that a completely different interpretation depending on the book you're writing, a book of fiction, a novel? We're going to ask that question on the basis of two novels. The first one, an immense success really, Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel, that was published in 2009. Wolf Hall is the first of a trilogy dealing with England in the 16th century. And the second book or novel or series that we're going to use or compare it to is the C.J. Sansam's Shard Lake stories, a series of novels. The first one was Dissolution in 2003, Dark Fire in 2004, etc. I think there's even a series, Netflix perhaps, and there's also there's been a series of Wolf Hall, I think, done by the BBC a few years ago. Now, Hilary Mantel died recently, a couple of years ago. She was an immense writer, a great writer from England. And Wolf Hall certainly brought her to the attention of the wider public. But I really recommend that you also have a look at her other novels, earlier novels, or her memoirs, which are absolutely fantastic. Giving Up the Ghost, it's called. Just a wonderful piece of self-narrative. And C.J. Sansom, he also made a big name for himself, not only through the Shard Lake series, but he also had a massive success, I think, with a book called Winter in Madrid from 2006. And Sansom predominantly wrote detective novels, so the Shard Lake series is basically a sort of detective, typical detective series set in England in the 16th century, and Shard Lake is a lawyer who basically finds himself in the middle of that period. Now, those two books, therefore, are set in the same period. Broadly speaking, England in the 16th century, very much London in the 16th century. And that period, as I'm sure you remember, had a few central figures. Henry VIII, of course, the king, warts and all, as the famous saying goes, but also Thomas Cromwell and Thomas More. Now, Thomas More of Utopia fame, of course, and Thomas Cromwell of political fame. Now, do not confuse this Cromwell with the Cromwell that will come later, of course. Thomas Cromwell was a secretary to the king, a minister of state, and he is basically widely associated with, because he was in charge of that approach at the time, he was, of course, associated with the attacks decided by Henry VIII against the Catholics. Now, you remember probably that England at that time was a Catholic country. It belonged to the Catholic religion. And it is from that time that, of course, England will move towards the Reformation movement, that is a Protestant type of Christianity, moving away from the Catholic denomination. What that means at that time, of course, is that Henry VIII, and therefore Thomas Cromwell, will go around the country reappropriating monasteries and abbeys and cathedrals and the like, which belong to the Catholic Church, but which the king now decides actually belong to the English king himself. That will lead to a very famous period in English history where the Catholics will be hunted down, the monasteries will be closed, their riches, their wealth, their possessions will be taken by the state, appropriated by the state. There will be numerous killings and murders of priests and Catholics in general, but certainly priests, a lot of them. And it was really a period of terror and repression of Catholics. Again, in a country which was, of course, predominantly Catholic and was still coming to terms with what was happening in Germany, as it were, of course, the Reformation and the development of the Protestant credo. Now, what do we have here? We have two novelists, Sansom, Mantel, both of whom have very strong sort of academic credentials as well. Sansom was a lawyer before he turned to fiction. And both of them very well educated in a period. So it's important to understand that when they talk about Thomas Cromwell, they really know who they're talking about, and when they describe the period and set their novels in that period, they really do know what they're talking about in terms of what happened, who did what, why. They've read the same texts, they have read the same history books, they have read the same sources, they have read, in fact, a lot of original sources as well. They didn't simply look at a couple of books and Wikipedia, they actually did the work for many years. As Mantel makes it very clear, it was the work of many years of research to really come to know the period and come to know what was happening. Always a difficult thing to do, 600 years after the fact, of course, and that is one of the points we'll come back to in a couple of seconds. So it's important to understand that both of them start from the same point, which is the same existing knowledge about that period. And this is where it becomes really interesting, because looking at Thomas Cromwell, Sansom and Mantel see a very different man, a very different person. They treat him both as an important character and a secondary one in the case of Sansom. That is, of course, making a difference eventually. But they see him in a completely different light. So, broadly speaking, for Hilary Mantel, Thomas Cromwell is a tortured soul, a tortured man. He's trying to come to grips with his own psychology, as it were, hemmed in by the king and his demands, his belief in his duties, his belief, his faith, his belief in the church as a broader idea, of course, than just a Catholic one, his belief in the rule of the king, and his belief also that he has to serve the king, that is his function, that is what he should be doing. So his duty, sense of duty. But he's torn between all this and what is actually happening in a country. Something he has a hand in, or more than that, is the figure of that repression against Catholics. So he is trying to navigate not only the very political waters, and of course the history and the story of this period is much more complicated than this. You may remember that the king was married and wanted at all costs to marry someone else, but couldn't divorce at the time because of the Catholic credo, so he had to find a way to divorce that first wife so that he would be allowed to marry a second one, which precipitated the schism, the departure, as it were, of the Church of England from the Catholic Church itself. So Mantel handles all this because Thomas Cromwell is at the heart of it. But this has an effect on him. So, for Hilary Mantel, Thomas Cromwell is really tortured. He's a man with deep thoughts, one would say, deep questions about who he is, what he should be doing, what is he doing, in fact. Is it right? Is it wrong? All those questions. Conversely, for Sansom, Thomas Cromwell is nothing of that. He is not a tortured soul reflecting on morality. He is cruel, he is cold, he is hard, he is the master spy. He has, in fact, spies all over the country. He never hesitates to kill his way through a problem or a situation. Thomas Cromwell, for Sansom, is the arch villain, is the sort of Moriarty of Henry VIII. is a terribly negative, terribly frightening figure in those novels. Now, of course, it is very clear that Sansam's use of Cromwell is derivative from the fact that it is inscribed in that period. In other words, the Shard Lake series is much more about Shard Lake and the history of the time, the monasteries and the like, of course, but it's very much about England at that time, also its legal system, and again, it's a detective series. So Cromwell is the villain who's everywhere around and behind, but he's not necessarily central. When he becomes central, he is then presented in that very cold-hearted person. Sansom, of course, doesn't do what Mantel does. Mantel puts Cromwell at the heart of her novels. In other words, it is really a portrait of England at the same time as a study of and a portrait of Thomas Cromwell. So obviously, because they have different statuses in those novels, they are used for different reasons, we cannot completely compare them. Nevertheless, it is striking that the same man, seen through the same documents and the same documentation and the same history books, comes out in such contrasting ways in those two novels. Now, that reminds us of a couple of points, of course, when it comes to that. And the first thing that everyone remembers from school, hopefully, is the, let's say, relativity of history. That is, of course, that we may know the facts. We may have dug deep to find all the facts. But the interpretation of those facts, and much more than that, the psychology of those facts, is of course something which is terribly, terribly difficult to find. We remember probably Murakami's quote, the facts might not be truthful and the truth might not be factual. And even though it seems paradoxical said like this, we do get a sense of what it means, that indeed sometimes the truth cannot simply be reduced to a couple of facts. The truth is bigger than the fact that we are given to assess it from. So the relativity of history here reminds us quite simply that ultimately for a historian and certainly for a novelist, there is a question of interpretation. How do I interpret the facts that I have? What do I see behind those facts? And what kind of world do I recreate when I play with, accumulate, use those facts? That interpretation, of course, is something that we must accept both as an imposition on a reader, as it were, because we do accept that a book is written by somebody, and that somebody has obviously first rights with their own story, so who are we to complain? If we don't like it, we simply drop the book. But at the same time, it reminds us that if we want to know, let's say, objectively, if it is possible, of course, but if we want to have a as objective as possible study of a period of a person in history, then we should look to non-fiction, of course. The job of a writer is to interpret the world or to give their world a certain resonance or to present their vision of their world in a certain way. Very obviously, as a reader, we can go along with that vision, we can oppose that vision, we can agree or disagree with it, but the starting point is the vision of the writer. Supposedly in non-fiction, the vision is an objective one of what happened and why. So it's important to make that distinction when we read historical fiction. A lot of us, when we do so, we want to know what the facts were. What did people wear? What did they eat? How did they think? What did they do? What was it like at that time? And we want that in a package of truth. That is, if I write a historical novel situated in England in the 18th century, and I talk about, I don't know, things that didn't exist at the time, or concepts that were unknown at the time, obviously, I am not giving you the truth about that history, about that period. Now, that is not what we want, typically as readers of historical fiction. We want to have a sense of what it was like, really, in truth. What was it like, in reality? Now, you can play with those elements to create a narrative, a fictional narrative, that's fine, but really at heart, most of us want those facts to be true. And it's enormously disappointing when we find out later on that in fact many of those facts, supposedly true, were not true. The writer needed some facts to get the story going. And so, yes, when, having to make a choice between the truth of facts which were not very interesting and inventing a couple to make it interesting, well, the role of a writer is to make those choices. The role of the reader is not to complain about them in many ways. Again, let's read non-fiction if that is the case. But it is a very important point to remember that when we come to historical fiction, we want to ask ourselves first and foremost, well, is it the role of the writer to provide us with only 100% factual information about the period? To what extent do we grant the freedom of roaming that frontier between truth and imagination to a novelist who starts off the contract between themselves and us, the reader, as, look, I'm going to tell you a story is fiction, it didn't happen, so even though the context looks realistic, factual and true, do not forget this is fiction. And that is, of course, what the great American historian Robert Darnton reminds us of, notably in his famous The Great Cat Massacre, a book in which he asks a simple question. Well, we know that in the 18th century in France, people used to burn cats to celebrate some events. Not just one or two cats, but making whole piles of cats and burning them. And he asked a question, of course, which is, well, why would people do this? Which is the factual aspect of history. But he is more interested in what he terms, what is known as the history of mentality. And that means, well, what kind of enjoyment did people derive from it? And what kind of thought process, what kind of world do you need to inhabit in order to derive enjoyment from what we would consider today to be cruelty and a terrible thing to do, of course. And so that history of mentality is really trying to understand how people lived then, but how they inhabited, mentally speaking, psychologically, that world. And that is, of course, again, the difference that we find between those two novels, the Mantel novel and the Sansom novel. This gap, this schism, perhaps, this chasm, certainly, between knowing factually, having access to the sources, and ultimately trying to recreate a mental world, something which is obviously very different. So in conclusion, two very, very good novels in their own right, two completely different novels, completely different genres, of course, different writing styles. You may remember that Wolf Hall, for example, is written in the present, which gives an immediacy, an immersion in the past that Sansom doesn't provide. Sansom is not really interested in all the psychological traits and characteristics of, let's say, Cromwell himself, of course, but even around him, he's much more interested in looking more broadly, perhaps, and also getting his detective story going. His narrative needs to have a different pace, of course, from a historical, psychological novel like Wolf Hall. But ultimately, those are two very, very good series. Shard Lake series is extremely enjoyable. At least, I think the first three novels are probably better than the rest. Very interesting, very well done, very pacey, page turners, while remaining true to the period, to the extent that he wants to be, of course, and to the needs that he has as a writer. And Wolf Hall, of course, is, well, it's a monument, I guess now, of recent English literature, world literature, probably. And it is a novel that will probably be read still in quite a while. Hilary Mantel herself, I think, is one of the towering figures of English literature in the last 40, 50 years. So I can only encourage you to go out and try them both. They are so very different that it will be going from one universe to a completely different one, and yet both of them set in the same world at the same time with partially at least the same cast of characters, which makes it all the more interesting and fascinating and gives us a great reminder of how diverse and how personal literature eventually is. Good reading. Thank you.